Welcome to the National Soccer Coaches Association of America Winter Webinar Series. My name is David Newberry and I'm the coordinator of the NSCAA Club Standards Project, an initiative designed to raise the performance of coaches and players one club at a time. Since May 2012, we have had over 360 clubs join us, representing 245,500 players and 22,000 coaches. I'm delighted today to have Ian Barker, the Director of Coaching Education for the NSCAA, to present today's topic, which is the coach development role of the Director of Coaching. Ian is the ideal individual to present today's topic, which is so important to the long-term success of any youth club. In our travels around the country, assessing clubs of all types, professional or volunteer, large or small, we find a common failing is insufficient focus and oversight, support, and education of coaches. Ian is somewhat unique, having held leadership positions both with US Youth Soccer and now with the NSCAA. Ian was the Director of Coaching and Player Development for Minnesota Youth Soccer Association for over 10 years, and in 2012 he was hired as the current position as the Director of Coaching Education for the NSCAA. Ian also has 21 seasons with men's programs at the University of Wisconsin and Macalester College. He is a national staff instructor for NSCAA and US Youth Soccer and is the head coach of the US Youth Soccer Region 2 Boys Olympic Development Program. Ian's qualifications are extensive and he holds the USSF A license, the NSCAA Premier Diploma, and the NSCAA Master Coach Diploma. So welcome again for the second time today, Ian, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you, David. I appreciate it, and thank you for those of you listening in, and certainly would like to honor your time commitment this evening. Certainly, during the course of the evening, I'll prompt you a couple of times to jot down some questions if you have them, and we'll get to some hopefully before the end of the evening, and then the others I'll respond to through a protocol which David will explain at the end. So as to the first slide, this is a picture of the Forth Bridge in Great Britain, and the urban myth surrounding this bridge is that there's a crew of individuals that paint the bridge, and it takes them close to a calendar year, and then when it's finished they have to start all over again. Now apparently I found out this is an urban myth, but I liken the job of Director of Coaching in terms of coach development and managing that part of the program as something akin to an ongoing process that you've never actually really finished because you're always working with it. And I think there's two ways to look at it, as an ongoing challenge or as an opportunity to evolve your club. And so I've looked at three broad areas of management for the club director as he or she puts the coaching staff together. I also think that you have to consider what you would consider success in terms of the management of your coaches. So one measure of success might be the growth of numbers, but that may not take into account changing demographics in your community. Another criteria might be you look at the competitive level that your teams increase through, and you've got more teams playing at higher levels. But I also think if you're doing a good job with your coaches, you're going to see this in retention. And so over a number of years, if you can monitor how many of your under 6s become under 8s in your program or under 12s become under 14s, then I think you start to see that your club programming has a little bit of stickiness to it. At the same time, as we manage the three elements I put together there, I encourage you to embrace your uniqueness as a club and be self-confident in comparison with other clubs. And so to managing your coaching diversity. I feel very strongly that we should all be cognizant of what I call the mercenary coach. And so sometimes you pay coaches, you have a small budget or a budget for this, and you find that you don't have a lot of great loyalty other than to the almighty dollar. And so whilst professional coaching sounds good and is commonly understood to be superior to volunteer coaches, if you have coaches which aren't going to commit to you for the long haul, including just perhaps even the season, maybe you are better served with volunteer and community-based coaching. As to experience, I think it's important to understand what experience you're bringing into your club. Are you bringing in the experience of somebody that's coached just for a long number of years? Are they particularly good at training particular age groups or skill levels? Are they preeminently recruiters? Do they win a lot of games? So what does that experience mean? And then the coach-player, player-to-coach dynamic I find very, very interesting. A club I worked with quite a lot in Minnesota, Rochester Youth Soccer Club, had a great experience where some of their parent coaches who didn't have extensive experience of playing subsequently became players after they started coaching, which I thought was a really positive thing because the coaches wanted to learn more about the game through practical experience, as opposed to where we often go after players and we make them coaches, and those individuals are not really coaches. They're actually people that just continue to play, and the coaching is just something they do, but they do it from a player perspective. And then finally, I'm sure we're all challenged at different times by the involvement of the parent coach in your programming, but I tend to think of the parent coach as a positive, because very often the parent coaches have a significant investment in the program, not just up to their child's experience, but also to the community and other elements of being involved with your programming. So I would embrace the parent coach and manage it whenever possible. As far as the player diversity goes, I would put this out there. I would suggest to you that you look at your programming in terms of coach resources as fair for everybody, but different. And I think this impacts your resource allocation. So if you have an in-house program which plays perhaps once or twice a week in your community, as opposed to another part of your programming which travels extensively nationally, possibly internationally, tournaments, etc., they're going to require different resources, different coaching resources, different equipment, and so on and so forth. So when I think about managing the player diversity and specifically to your coaching, I would suggest you make it fair for everybody, so every group is equally attended to, but how that attention is paid will almost certainly look a little bit different. And then finally, as my three key elements, the notion of managing for the present and the future. And I would put this to you. I would say that try to avoid painting yourself into a corner. So I believe strongly in the notion of being reflexive and discretionary. And that is to say, you as the director of coaching reserve the right at different times to make judgment calls which perhaps aren't consistent with all of your programming up to that point. So as a particular coaching resource comes in, or you decide that this parent coach is absolutely the best fit, where typically you steer away from using parent coaches. And again, the benchmark for your success, I would put it to you, is the retention of player interest over a number of years based on soccer reasons. So as opposed to bribing the kids to come back, if the coaches that you employ and you produce give the kids a good experience and they like the sport over other opportunities they may have to leave your programming and they decide to stay with you, then you've probably run a successful coaching program. Now, as I pop into these 10 strategies, again, I encourage you to just jot down any questions you might have for David or myself, and we'll happily try to get to some of them at the end. When I came up with 10 strategies, it just seemed like a nice round number and very David Letterman-esque of me. So hopefully they're not too elongated, these 10, and too stretched, and they're not too condensed. An important place to start, vision, mission, and values. And I think I would consider this in terms of the club. What are the club standards, expectations? What are the individual team expectations? And certainly, as you look to employ coaches, whether that be for money or for the love of the game, but as you start to employ them and put them in place, what are the missions, values, vision of the coach? And are they compatible with the club and the team? And a good example I would use is the coach might talk about the desire to play all of the kids equally in the program, and the club may have an expectation that this particular team is going to seek advancement through the league structures, promotion. And so the coach's desire to mete out playing time equitably might be in contradiction to the aspirations of that particular team or that particular element of the club, and vice versa. And so I do think your coaches need to understand what your club and team mission statement and goals are. And then into communication. I think it's critical that when you communicate with your coaches, especially during the season, that you avoid spamming them. And too often I've seen coaching directors find interesting articles, promise they're going to send them out in a newsletter on a regular basis, and they're not really looked forward to after a couple of weeks, and they're kind of just deleted, and they really are just treated as spam. And so consequently, I would suggest to the director of coaching, when you communicate with your coaches, make it very relevant to them, which might mean that you have to produce a couple of articles and a couple of different things that speak to different elements of your programming. And I would certainly try to create a sort of a buzz or a hunger for when this information comes through to your coaches. So for example, send them one activity, one training activity, and suggest that it's part of a plan, and then explain to them where they can go to find that plan. Or send them a one-lesson plan with 2 or 3 activities, and then suggest them where they might be able to find 2 or 3 more lesson plans like that. But again, make it relevant and avoid spamming them. As we look now to education, and I've got 2 slides for education, and the first one I would put you is sort of on a shared basis. This is where coaches come together and they experience the educational opportunity together. And that might be through an NSCAA program, US soccer program, any other number of completely legitimate licensing, diploma granting bodies. But it almost also might be through clinic opportunities which your club provides, which are exclusive of formal licensing and diplomas. And it might be that you are able as a club DOC to support your coaches in going out to some of these opportunities. Perhaps the NSCAA convention would be something obviously I would try to plug, but other symposia and clinics. So the notion of a shared educational program where the coaches are in the kind of environment that we see here on the slide, as opposed to education part B, where I'm thinking now more of an individual accessing a little bit more at a self-select basis in a little bit more personal and intimate way. And so with this type of education, it could be very specific to the needs of the individual coach and respond to those needs. And it might be they reach out to you or you identify that you need to give them this support. And very often, allowing the coach to access educational opportunities in this way is far less stressful than formal coaching education where diplomas and awards are given out. And some coaches simply don't learn very well in those environments and learn far better from some other resources that you might choose to provide. And then moving on to my 5th strategy, as it were. And this one's kind of near and dear to my heart, and I think as important as anything else that I've got to discuss today. And that is making sure that your placement of coaches bears in mind the developmental appropriateness of the coach's experience, desires, communication styles, abilities, and mirrors the developmental appropriate needs of the players. And so stealing a little bit from my colleagues in US Youth Soccer, simply put, does the coach understand the physical capabilities of the players, the cognitive capabilities of the player, and certainly the emotional, social needs of the players based on age, gender, competitive level, experience, perhaps even socioeconomics. And so is your coach the right person for that group of players? I think that's really critical. And I would just throw one crazy idea out there. As we as DOCs look for coaching, and we look for coaches at different times of the year, there's a resource I think that's practically speaking untapped, and that would be teachers. During some of the key times of our seasons, very often school is out, and there are a whole bunch of teachers who are not actively involved in their professional responsibilities. Now, these individuals may not know a tremendous amount about soccer, but they certainly know a tremendous amount about dealing with children of certain ages. And so I've always thought it would be a good idea to perhaps pursue some elementary and junior high teachers to see if you can give them some employment opportunities and get them involved. So just an idea. As we move now to number 6, just before I talk about this, just again like to plug and invite you to jot down some questions. And so to roles and responsibilities. I think this is a very important nuance and distinction for a club director of coaching to consider. Are your coaches particularly good teachers in teaching the finer points of the game, the techniques, etc.? Are they really are much more adept at dealing with administration and sometimes parents and politics, politics with a small p? Or are they particularly good tactical game coach, or some combination of the bunch? This photo that is on the screen right now, as I understand it, the young woman coach is actually the daughter of the gentleman in the picture, and I assume went through the program and has now come out the other side as a coach working with her father and discussing the game. They're clearly having an interaction there about what's going on in the field. So in this dynamic, we can make some assumptions, but I don't think it's unreasonable to assume that in combination they probably form a better coaching situation for the young female athletes pictured, perhaps than they would do individually. So between them, they're sharing a different set of roles and responsibilities within the broader coaching scheme. And then my next slide, if you can just see at the top of the text box, there's an empty chair there. And that chair was being sat in at the time this photo, previously, prior to the photo being taken by Jose Mourinho at an NSCAA event in Los Angeles. And the group of men you see there are Jose Mourinho's coaching staff, the full Real Madrid coaching staff. So he is able to have a very significant opportunity for collaboration with his coaching and his development of players. As DOC, though, what I would suggest to you is there are opportunities to perhaps use your resources in a collaborative fashion that might be really beneficial. And I stole this idea a little bit from Director of Coaching for Arkansas Youth Soccer, Robert Parr. So, for example, if you suggest to your club that you'd like all of your under-10s to train on the same evening in the same location, perhaps your A, B, and C teams or your red, blue, and white teams all show up together, and now you might be able to place one more experienced coach with perhaps one younger coach who's a particularly good demonstrator and perhaps one parent coach. And so consequently, you've got different coaching energies working together with the under-10s. So trying to treat your coaching education and your coach development as more of a club initiative as opposed to an individual team initiative. Along those lines, I would also encourage you to look at the best practice of other clubs at the of clubs of a similar nature to yours, and what are they doing to develop their staff. And certainly, if you can encourage collaboration within your coaching staff to understand what the kids were doing a couple of years previously in the program, so what did the under-6 coach do with them before they became under-8s with the current coaches, and what do the under-10 coaches want to see for those kids as they move up through the program. And so really tying the whole part together as a club. In mentorship, this is not a picture of David or myself, so that's okay. But certainly we have the formal top-down type mentorship as a director of coaching, perhaps yourself, master coaches, hired coaches who have a senior role in your club. So we certainly are aware of that. But I also think it's very helpful to let your coaches occasionally observe, just simply observe other coaches within your club in action. So as the director of coaching, sometimes rather than you evaluate your coach and watch them, perhaps you take their team and give them an evening off, as it were, to go and observe another coach in action. And it doesn't have to be, by definition, a better or weaker coach. It doesn't have to be from the same age group. But just let them sit down and watch somebody struggle with managing 14, 15 kids and how do they set up areas and so on and so forth. And that might be as good an educational opportunity as you observing them and them being stressed out because you're looking over their shoulder. And then another little idea, which I've talked to with a few coaches, is the notion of buddy systems within the club. So at the beginning of the season, hook up the U17 boys coach with the coach of a U13 girls team and just encourage them to have a couple of cups of coffee, a phone call, an email exchange just about what's happening with their management of their teams and their teaching of their teams. And they don't have to be related teams in any significant way other than beyond the club, but it's just somebody to bounce a few ideas off, and they don't have to always go to the DOC. And then my ninth suggestion is I think there's many methods and options when it comes to evaluation. But I would certainly recommend that you avoid scoring with a numerical or a letter system, because much like the kids with tryouts, if you start giving those types of grades, the coaches will go and compare themselves with each other, or they'll challenge you as to why they can get the maximum score. So I think some evaluative tools are very useful, but I'd avoid scoring. I would also really encourage you to allow the coaches some reflection upon their performance. And so if your coaches understand clearly the mission and value of the club, they understand your priorities as a club, then they should be able to evaluate how they did. And then you can then sit down with them, and before you have to tell them, you can listen a little bit to see what they have to say and how they reflect on their experiences with the team. And then my 10th strategy would be how you manage reward. And of course, like anything, we'd like to see more intrinsic as opposed to extrinsic. And I think purely who can pay the most money is certainly a reward structure, but it's not necessarily going to create loyalty and sense of community to your club. So a couple of things, a couple of good strategies, I think, is to try to acknowledge the contribution of your coaches, and do that through what I would call connection. So that's, I think, some website promotion, do a little feature on them, a little bio on them, a couple of quotes. And I definitely think, my experience certainly tells me that even some of your more aloof and challenging coaches to deal with really would value the opportunity to sit and have a chat with the DOC and a cup of coffee. And sometimes that's all the acknowledgement that your coaches need for their contributions, just to let them know that you notice and you're appreciative. And certainly sometimes that can be the most powerful way of keeping coaches in your program loyal and developing, as opposed to simply which club can pay the most. And then to my next slide, this is just something I talked with David a little bit, came up with a few concepts here. But when I think of club, I think of expressing through your coaching development the culture of your club. So I think the coaches that you employ, that you use, are very often a reflection of the culture of your club. And anytime you can express community with them, whether that's a social hour, a local bar or restaurant where if it's close to your fields, they can maybe head to for a glass of beer or a cup of coffee afterwards. I think those type of interactions are really valuable and creates that club identity and that club community. And then of the 5 C's on the sheet there at the bottom, competency. To me, this means that you identify in every one of your coaches, again, acknowledging a very diverse group, that each one of them has a contribution to make, and each one of them has a skill set or competency that you value and that means something to your club and does a great job for your club. So I think expressing that value to them is really powerful anytime you can do it. And then a last concluding quote there, and certainly again, please jot down a few questions because this is the conclusion of my part of the seminar. But I like this quote because I think it tends to suggest that what you're trying to do is create a product with your coaching that is the sum of all the parts, and it ultimately is greater than each individual part. And so your responsibility as the DOC, amongst many other responsibilities that I'm very aware that DOCs have, is to consciously manage the diversity of your coaches, the diversity of your members, their players and their parent groups, and then continually plan and tweak and work on it and consciously manage all those moving parts to come up with something which ultimately is a collective whole and strength.